This is TLV1.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern. If you are in New York City on Sunday, the 11th of June, join me for a live recording of the podcast at Hebrew Union College in Manhattan. I'll be interviewing Yale University historian Timothy Snyder about his best-selling book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. The recording will be the concluding session of a day of learning entitled The Seventh Day, Israel at a Crossroads on the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, that is organized by ARTA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. It will feature keynote presentations, a panel discussion, and breakout workshops with leading thought leaders and community activists. The event will be open to the public, and you should all come, but be sure to sign up because space is limited. For more details, go to www.arta.org.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin, speaking to you from New York City, still without your co-host Gilad Halpern, but fear not, New Yorkers, Gilad will be doing a live interview event on June 11th in the Big Apple that you will not want to miss. Go to our Facebook page, Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel, for more details. Every week we interview people producing research and books that make our lives more interesting. Or in this case, our guest's own life is the interesting part, and he's not even halfway through, maybe 1/3 through. May you live to 120. Shulem Deen. Shulem is the author of All Who Go Do Not Return, published in 2015 by Grey Wolf Press. He's a regular contributor to The Forward. He's written in the New Republic, Salon, Tablet Magazine, among other outlets. And he's a board member of Footsteps, an organization helping those who leave ultra-orthodox Jewish life, or what we call Chozer B'Sheila. Shulem Deen, thank you for being on the program.
Sure, thank you for having me.
You were deeply embedded in one of the most insular Hasidic communities of Brooklyn. You even say at one point that it was considered extremist by other Haredi or ultra-Orthodox communities. Then you left. That's what your book is about. And now you live pretty much entirely in the secular world, as I understand it.
Yep.
Let's start with a simple question. How's life? Do you feel totally adjusted to life now, or do you think about the world you used to inhabit, rules, rituals, routines, sort of defining that community?
Well, I'm totally adjusted to my life as it is. I mean, who's ever fully adjusted to anything?
That is a good question.
Of course, I've left that world. This was a very significant transition. My thinking tends to be refracted through a lens of Judaic texts, often, especially when it comes to values questions. I mean, not entirely. Obviously not everything that we deal with today has some kind of source within sort of Jewish tradition and things like that. And I think sometimes the values we would like to hold to force them into some kind of Jewish context sometimes feels a little bit contrived. But I do tend to think of things in terms of the traditions I was raised with. Even though I now have no religious orientation whatsoever, I consider myself a secular Jew, a cultural Jew, whatever term, or one of those related terms. But my life now is fairly typical for anyone in New York who is, or anyone anywhere who is trying to do creative work. I'm a writer, I'm a freelancer. And so with all the attendant anxieties that comes with trying
Which are manifold,
trying to get work out and trying to get compensated for that work. And so, yeah, I have a strong network of friends, largely made up of people who come from similar backgrounds as I do, although not entirely. I have a fairly robust network of writer friends and other people who do creative work who aren't really, or certainly not exactly from my background or like my background, but my life is fairly typical. I live a fairly normal New York life, I guess.
Yeah.
That's
but in some ways you've retained the ways of thinking or processing that you grew up with, but without the ritual. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think that's also fairly typical New York, because most of New York, I mean, certainly I live in Brooklyn. Most of Brooklyn comes from somewhere else now. It's not like when I grew up here where everyone from Brooklyn was from Brooklyn. Now people come from wherever, and there's such diversity. And people bring their pasts with them to whatever they're doing now. And I bring my past with me in the same way that so many other people bring their pasts, whether it might be a spiritual or religious tradition or a cultural background or whatever it might be.
I think that when you read a story like this, whenever people hear about big transformations, life transformation stories, they want to know how it happened. And you make a very interesting point in the book that when people ask you about it, they seem to expect to hear about this great moment, like Paul on the road to Damascus. What was the moment when you decided to leave that community? And you sort of respond to that and say it's not one thing, but many things. Right. Maybe even some imperceptible shifts, lots of things that happened over time. I wondered, though, if you could try to point out maybe some aspects, not so much incidents, but things, maybe underlying reasons that led to your change. I mean, could it be your personality and individual qualities, your background, or your specific experiences? Can you pinpoint a few of those?
Sure. I mean, there were pivotal moments, pivotal experiences. I would say when I got married, I was 18 years old, and I got married to a woman that I really did not want to marry, not because there was something particularly wrong with her. I just felt like I just didn't feel like we were a good match. But the guidance I was given by my spiritual mentors, by my sort of religious instructors, was that this was a good match for me. And obviously this was, in the Hasidic world, typically matches are arranged. I didn't know this girl, and I'd never met her, and we were engaged after just a formal meeting of less than 10 minutes, and right after that the engagement was announced, and we eventually ended up being together for almost 15 years, and through those 15 years I felt somewhat resentful that I'd been that I'd been sort of made to feel compelled to enter into a relationship that I really didn't want. Now, that itself, I would have kept doing that. So the reason I did it was because I felt I was performing a religious obligation. And over years, I would begin to feel that my attachment to the principles and the dogmas of the Hasidic life, Haredi life, Orthodox life in general, my attachment to that was weakening. And as my attachment to that was weakening, my resentment within this marriage was growing greater, because if I no longer had the religious obligation that led me into it, then why was I staying in it? And so that caused a really significant strain. And so it was a whole bunch of psychological factors that came together. The most important, I think, would be that I shifted in my thinking about how to see the world, and I started questioning. The world I was raised in was very insular, and at some point I found my way to outside sources of information, and I began to question some of the basic precepts of our lifestyle. Once that happened, and they sort of progressed incrementally from questioning the role of our Hasidic leaders, to then questioning the authority of the rabbis of the Talmud, to then questioning all of Orthodox dogma. Once I started doing that, I felt my faith erode more and more, and the consequence of that was I was living in a community that doesn't allow for dissent, doesn't allow for any kind of nonconformity, even any social nonconformity. Not wearing a black coat, but wearing a yellow coat is going to drastically reduce your prospects for a good marriage.
Not just yellow. I mean, you have a scene in the book where you're wearing just the wrong kind of Hasidic garb or the wrong kind of waistband, and you get chastised for not looking like you're actually for being goyish.
Right. As a 13-year-old boy, I wasn't wearing my gartel. The gartel is the waistband that Hasidic men wear. Most Hasidic communities insist on wearing it during prayer and sometimes during Torah study, but among our group, the Skverers, it was worn all the time. And so conformity is really important, and dissent is not tolerated.
You raised another point just now when you talked about part of your sort of process, I guess I'm not sure what I would call it, of moving away from that community had to do with asking questions and there not being such a tolerance for asking those kinds of critical questions. And I'm again returning to a scene in the book where you're learning with your children and you're telling them to think about how to interpret what you're learning. And you mentioned that you can see your wife is critical because she feels like you're infecting their mind with heresy. I think that those are the words that you used. And I wonder, is critical thinking itself a heresy in this community?
Oh, absolutely. You cannot question the basic dogmas of Orthodox Judaism. I get this question a lot. How is it possible that your community was one that did not allow questioning when Judaism is so much about asking questions? And
well, that was my next question. I'm sorry it's so cliche.
Right. Well, this question has always... It took me a long time to sort of figure out where this question comes from. And I guess because the world of liberal Judaism, and the world of Jews general in the liberal world, is one that sees Jewish tradition as one that has always been open to a very intellectually rigorous kind of thinking. I think what people are often entirely unaware is that intellectually rigorous within certain boundaries, within a certain framework, but not outside of it. I mean, the Talmud and Maimonides, even who was a philosopher, but in his law codes actually writes very adamantly about accepting certain aspects of faith. I mean, Maimonides was a rationalist, and so he tried to reconcile that with Aristotelian philosophy and things like that. But it's very clear that you cannot question the basic premises and with the assumption that you will follow wherever the inquiry leads. You must end up at a certain goal point.
So it's almost like, is it really an inquiry?
Right, exactly. Or at least when it comes to the real fundamental questions. So obviously, there's always been lots of argumentation about the specifics of Jewish theology and obviously the specifics of Jewish law and things like that. But the fundamental, the ikarim of emunah, the fundamentals of faith, while some of them were not completely... right now we know the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides established. Those are the principles of faith, the dogmas of the Orthodox world, and we know that historically they may not all have been as central to normative Judaism as the sort of retrospective Orthodox narrative would have you believe, but there certainly was a position that there are ikarim. There were fundamentals, and they were fundamental to Judaism, and you could not deny them.
Right. So that leads me to an interesting question about the friend, I think, that who was very central to your process of moving away from your faith. I mean, you met this person who raised for you the tension between philosophy, modernity, and belief. And if I understand correctly, he believed in finding a logical and empirical basis for faith, and you had been trained to think that faith should be for its own sake, complete belief. Can you explain why that tension was so fundamental for you that it actually, advanced this process of moving away?
I should say when he sort of opened me to this world, and there's something very beguiling about the idea that you can use empirical and logical processes to determine the truth of what you would until then taken simply on faith, and something that was very important to you. And so for a long time, I really wanted to accept his approach. I wanted his approach to work. Ultimately, it simply doesn't, because there are different ways of reconciling religion and science, right? I mean, the most common that people use is, I think, what Stephen Jay Gould calls separate magisteria, or I forget the particular term, which is that they're different realms, religion and science, and you can't seek to combine them because they answer different questions, they serve different purposes. What I was trying to do was I was trying to combine the two. And it's not like I had it's not like I had very sort of sophisticated questions of science that didn't work with religious belief. problems that were very basic that I just never thought about, and they were
Like what?
the plausibility of the biblical narrative as historical fact. Now there are hundreds, thousands of Orthodox Jews, religious observant Orthodox Jews, who do not see the biblical narrative as historical fact, and it doesn't bother them at all, and they are able to continue living observant lives because they keep it separate. For me, that was not a possibility, because my religious belief, my religious practice was so deeply rooted in a kind of a truth that was more than a mythic truth. It was rooted in the idea that this is historic truth. And now if I was going to shift and say it's not historic truth, it's only mythic truth, I would have to recreate my entire theology. And when I tried to do that, I simply couldn't do it. It didn't hold up. I couldn't create a theology for myself that accepted the narrative as mythic truth, and I couldn't find anyone who made a plausible, who gave me a theology that did work and that I could accept, that I could feel was true and something that I could fully embrace. It simply, I couldn't make one, and I couldn't find someone who had done it convincingly for me. And so the only path forward for me was essentially to say, okay, I simply have to reject the dogmas. I had nowhere else to go.
Right. So that brings me to questions about the insularity of this community. When you say you had nowhere else to go, I mean, these communities, you describe almost a parallel world. You grew up in Brooklyn and Borough Park, you studied at New Square, then in Montreal, and everywhere you describe situations where you practically don't meet or see even anybody else, really. And you even have your own currency, which is interesting, kind of raises the questions of quasi-sovereign communities.
Right.
What is the dissonance like? I mean, you're studying things that have to do with how to bore a hole in a slave's ear, and then you have nowhere else to go with that, so you enter a new world. I mean, is this a tremendous just physical rupture of having to suddenly work in a world that you don't have frames of reference for?
It can be a really difficult process. I think this process cannot be, the difficulties of this cannot be overstated. For a long time, one of the reasons that I stayed within that world, even though I no longer had my faith, was because I didn't know how to move into a different world. In other words, from a religious perspective, I was no longer on the same page with the rest of my community. But culturally, that was the only world I knew. I only knew their language, and their language means not just the particular language that they spoke, which was Yiddish, and a very particular form of Yiddish, which is American Hasidic Yiddish. Not that different from Israeli Hasidic Yiddish, but Hasidic Yiddish as opposed to...
And English being rather scorned in schools.
English being scorned, English being really not very well taught. I was fortunate that both of my parents spoke to us in English at home, because my parents actually did not grow up within the Hasidic world. And I had what you could consider a almost an Ivy League secular education for the Hasidic world, because we had actually 4 days a week, at the end of the day, for 2 hours, we studied English and math, just very basic English and math during elementary school from 3rd to 8th grade. We had those 2 hours at the end of the day. So, obviously no high school and no subjects like, history or science or anything like that. No art, certainly no athletic program, but we had the basics. But I was fortunate. I mean, I have 2 sons who are now 15 and 17 who cannot speak, read, or write English past the 1st grade level, because that's all they got in their school. And so it really is very difficult. I did not know how I would possibly move into a world outside the world I was living in. I could not imagine how I would... I could not imagine simply how I would find my way as a person in a society that I did not understand and couldn't really make sense of culturally.
one of the things that stands out about this insularity is the internal insularity, too. I mean, the almost cellular level division and subdivisions of the different communities within the Hasidic world that you described, from the Skverers to the Breslavs, and, your attempt to place your father within one of them. That kind of subdividing seems strange. It seems striking to an outsider reading it. But that made me wonder if I am noticing this only as an outsider, and if I were to turn the lens on other communities, we may be equally subdivided and insular within ourselves, including surrounding ourselves with people who think just like us. And I wonder if you, sort of coming to the secular world as an outsider and looking in, see that. I mean, do you think these kinds of internal, insular, cellular divisions of communities are really so unique to the Hasidic world, or do we have them in different forms in the secular world too?
That's a very interesting question. The Hasidic world is inherently organized around a kind of tribalism and sort of tribes and sub-tribes and so forth. And I think that kind of tribalism is very central to Hasidic life, because community is central to Hasidic life, and so and identity is central to Hasidic life, and so it goes down to an even more granular level, because that is so important to belonging, to identifying not just broadly but even more specifically to the particular group. I think broader society is not so dependent. I don't think we see identity in terms that are so stark. I mean, identity is important in so many parts of our world, of our society, but I think you might say that that identity in the Hasidic world is an identity of exclusion. An identity in the outside world is an identity of inclusion, in the sense that we're trying to, even as people maintain their identities, we're trying to include them all in one conversation. Whereas the Hasidic world has identities of exclusion, where they're trying to say, we are separate from you. We are Skverers, and therefore we are separate from you as Satmars, and separate from you as Belzers. Whereas identity in broader world, I think, we would say, I am of this or that ethnic identity, or this or that religious identity, and we are trying to integrate all of these identity into one cohesive society in a way. I'm not necessarily succeeding at it, but that seems to be the project. Mm-hmm. And the Hasidic community is not generally engaged in that project. It takes for granted that there is a general cohesion in the Hasidic world. It doesn't need to reinforce that cohesion. There's lip service given to ideas like Achdut and Klal Yisrael and things like that. And those are sort of abstract concepts that I'm not going to say they're not important, but they are not central to the lived experience of a typical Hasid.
Right. I mean, you have this painful moment, also a striking moment where you're at the birth of your first child and you have to leave and you need some money to get back on the bus, and you see a Lubavitch. Was he
No, he was a Litvak.
He was a Litvak, sorry. And he barely gives you the time of day. He gives you a few quarters, and you're shocked.
I was absolutely shocked.
Why were you so shocked?
Because the Hasidic world, I guess, I just never experienced something like that, because the Hasidic world certainly, but I would say that even the Haredi world more broadly tends to be, obviously with exceptions, but there's a very, very high value placed on generosity, chesed, acts of kindness. The actual halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Jewish Code of Law, which is central to all of Orthodoxy, is that when one who is hungry and asks for food, you do not question, right? In other words, Jewish law has this concept that if someone is asking you for help, you don't doubt the fact that they need it. They might be charlatans. They might really not need help. but you don't question the fact that they need help. You can choose to help them or not, and that's a separate question. But the fundamental thing is, you take for granted that when someone asks for help, they need it. And so this was this attitude that this person gave me. Was very unusual. It's certainly unusual in the Hasidic world, and I would say it's even unusual in the yeshivish world, the broader Haredi world. I think this was just a guy who had a bad day. At that moment, I was inclined to see it, because he's a Litvak, and we Hasidim are better than that. But I don't think that's true. I think if you go to non-Hasidic communities, you will find also a very, very high level of generosity and hospitality and charity and philanthropy. But there is this kind of sense among different groups that we are better than that group. Mm-hmm. And that was one example of that.
There's so much about insider and outsider identities in your book and in life, right?
Right.
And I was thinking about the fact that, as you mentioned, your parents were not originally religious. They were social activists, hippies, Beatles fans, before they became Baalei Tshuva, people who become religious, ultra-orthodox of their own accord. And, you imply in the book that there are ways in which you felt different. Like you said, you had a different kind of education. And I guess I wondered, is the ultra-Orthodox community so insular that even members who are wholly committed are treated just differently enough, even in subtle ways, that their children maybe have a bit of an outsider subconscious perception? And could that have contributed to your eventual distancing?
I think that is true. I think there is a higher proportion among those who leave ultra-Orthodoxy. There's a higher proportion of those who were born to Baalei Tshuva parents than to FFB, which is from birth, which can be a little bit misleading though, because there's still a very small minority. Most people who are raised within the Haredi world, whether their parents were Baalei Tshuva or not, remain within that world and generally do not go through some major crisis that leads them to leave. And the crises that lead people out of that world, they're not that different from those whose parents are Baalei Tshuva and not. They are questions of dealing with problematic worldviews and questioning the ideology and also suffering certain forms of trauma and abuse and in certain ways that some people, the most vulnerable, are sometimes not protected in a society like the ultra-Orthodox world. These affect people in the same way whether your parents are Baalei Tshuva or not. But I do think there is a sense of difference that most people try to really suppress and bury away and not think about. And it is possible and maybe probable that once you start dealing with other issues, that sense of difference becomes more pronounced to yourself. And in my case, that I can't say that was not the case. It didn't feel that way to me. But I can't say that was entirely not the case. And I think there's one simple material factor that has to be considered, and that is my family was a small nuclear family. It was just my parents and my siblings and I, and we were only 4 children. My father died when I was very young, and so we were a small family.
That's very small for the community.
It's very small for the community, but importantly, we weren't an extended clan of grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and all of that. And so my departure would affect far fewer people than the departure of someone who is part of an extended family. And I think that is probably true for many others whose parents were Baalei Tshuva. And I think the effect on those around you that you're leaving will have is something that people really take into strong consideration when deciding to make a transition like this one. And so if you don't have that is one impediment less to deal with.
So these big family and social networks create their own sort of web effect of keeping people inside.
Absolutely. And the Hasidic community also is one that, whether intentionally or unintentionally, creates structures of dependency on both community and family. Because men are given such poor secular education. I mean, women aren't given great secular education either, but men get even less. But then they have to provide for very large families, and so they have to figure out how to do it. And so largely it's an economic system where you have to rely on people you're related to, people you're close to from shul, from your other parts of your religious community. And so to suddenly leave all that behind and try to make a life outside of that world, for most people is so difficult to imagine.
Right. Well, you raise a very interesting point that was on my mind reading it. Just to bring it to the Israeli context for a minute, some of the criticism of the ultra-orthodox community in Israel from the secular world is that they are given subsidies by the government, and they have, we have generous sort of subsidies for them, and that their networks allow them to live a life where they don't actually have to go out and work and be part of, participate in mainstream life. And I understood that your process, in addition to all the sort of philosophical and faith-based questions that you had, you also had economic pressure. You were moving from job to job and struggling to support 5 children and a wife. And that seemed to be part of your process of looking for jobs in the secular world in order to make a living. One could read this as an indictment of the Israeli system, in a way, and say, well, the system is too generous and allows people to live that way so that they flourish and then have disproportionate power in society and politics. What do you think of that approach?
I don't think we need to look to my story to see an indictment of the Israeli system. I think the Israeli system of subsidizing Haredi life is extremely problematic. But I'm not an expert on Israeli, certainly not Israeli politics, but the politics of the Haredi world and the non-Haredi world in Israel are obviously, they're complicated, and they tie into the broader politics of Israel and government building, coalition building, and all that. And that's one area of significant difference between the American and Israeli Haredi community. In Israel, it has generally been the sense that Haredi men don't work. In the U.S., that is generally not true and has never been the sense. And I think there's a bit of an error there, because in Israel, it was the idea that men are not going to work was established as a way to get out of military service way back in the early years of the founding of the state. And so in order to avoid military service, men had to remain in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, and they had to remain in yeshiva. But in the U.S., that was never the case.
So you're saying it's actually not really theologically rooted?
No, it's rooted in the idea that the Haredim don't want to serve in the military.
But that's not a Jewish source.
That's where it starts.
That's not a Jewish source.
That's not. Well, they're afraid of the influence of secularization. They're afraid of the secular influence of the army, and so they sort of. It sort of got twisted in what comes first, right?
Right. Because in the Israeli discourse, they communicate that this is their, if not exactly halacha, that it is certainly, some sort of tradition, custom, or textually driven that they are supposed to spend their lives studying. I mean, they won't say openly that it's because they don't want the influence of the military, or maybe they will in other contexts.
Right, but if you see the historical development of how that happened, it's clear that it was a result of Haredim not wanting to serve in the military. That was the very explicit arrangement that Ben Gurion had with the Haredi parties, where he said, it was just the several hundred military eligible men who they were seeking exemptions for them, and so they that was the way they got out of it. But if you look to the American Haredi community, sure, there is a significant portion that remains in the study hall for as long as they can manage it economically. Young men who get married and they don't yet have children will study for some years after marriage, and they will often get a subsidy from what's called the kollel, which is the yeshiva for married men. But at some point, they will go out and find jobs, and no one says that there's anything wrong with that. People generally accept that is the reality of life, especially when you have 8, 10, 12 kids, which is absolutely normal, especially in the Hasidic world. People go out and find work. People in the American Haredi community, men in the American Haredi community absolutely do participate in the workforce. What they can do is find find jobs that require advanced education, find jobs that would require college degrees and things like that. And so they're not going to be in lucrative professions. They're not going to be attorneys. They're not going to be, they're not going to be doctors. They can be accountants and computer programmers and things like that. And they can certainly be in sales and marketing. And, they can be entrepreneurs. They can open their own businesses. And that's one area where some Hasidic men are indeed very successful. But that is a key difference between the American and the Israeli community and the Israeli Haredi community. Having said that, I do think there is an indictment of the American Haredi community there, which is that the American Haredi community insists on remaining separate and apart from the rest of society, certainly culturally, as long as they don't need to interact with it economically or for other reasons. And they reject the outside culture. They don't participate in what we might say the larger human enterprise of progress, of whether it's scientific progress, technological progress, economic progress, whatever it is. But
what's the indictment? I mean, do you think that's wrong? Are you angry about that?
Well, so they don't participate in that. They can only do this while they live in a scientifically, technologically advanced, economically advanced society, because otherwise they themselves would have to do the work that others are doing. I mean, if you take the Hasidic community out of Brooklyn and put them on a desert island, they will have to figure out how the human body works and become doctors.
And start from scratch.
They will have to learn physics and engineering and build their own roads and homes and bridges and tunnels. But now they have other people doing that for them. Now, I don't want to use the obvious word that comes to mind, which is, which one would think of when there is a community only taking and not giving back. But that really is, to me, a very philosophically problematic position to take, to live in a world where you not only are taking advantage of all the benefits the surrounding society gives you, but you cannot live by your own ideology without taking from this society, but you do not want to participate in what the broader society contributes. You're not sending your young people to college to study science, to study medicine, to study economics, and to contribute back to the world. And I think that is its own indictment of Haredi ideology, whether it's in Israel or in the U.S.
Yet, we have to finish up soon, but I am struck by the fact that you write this book without a great sense of anger. You don't seem to, it's not vitriolic. Your tone is very, calm as you describe these experiences. Do you feel anger against this community? And maybe that's part of the next question, which is, what do you miss the most about, I'm sure you miss things from your previous life.
I have anger towards certain individuals. I mean, I was put through hell when I left, and I mean, it came at a very, very high cost. Most significantly, I mean, I lost my family. I lost my access to my relationship with my children, which was absolutely devastating. It was a higher cost than anything I could have imagined.
Yeah, we should say you have 5 children.
Right, yeah. And in some ways, I was somewhat naive about thinking that I could leave and maintain a strong relationship with them. I certainly could have done things differently if I would do things over again. And so I am angry at individuals, but I'm not angry at the society as a whole. I mean, it was a lifestyle and a community that I felt nurtured by and sustained by and uplifted by. When I was part of it, I very much believed in its principles, and I very much it was a source of spiritual sustenance that was genuine and vital. And it was only when I lost my faith in it that I felt this alienation from this community. But as long as and when I lost that faith, it was traumatic because I didn't want to lose it because it was actually that important to me. It was almost like losing an essential source of nourishment of any kind. Like if you lose your food source, or if you lose, you're suddenly in a place where there's no water. You're like, how do you live without water? And so how do I live without the spiritual sustenance that Haredi life gave me as a Haredi person? When I lost that, it was a very, very significant trauma. And so in many ways, you ask what I miss. I have to say that I miss the existential certainty of why, what is the purpose in life? Why we're here, where we're going, what is good, what is bad, how do we decide the big questions, and how do we decide, how do we make decisions on how to live day by day?
Right.
That world is a world where you have it is a value system and a belief system that gives you very, very clear answers to questions. There are no questions in that world. There are no questions that have no answers. Yeah. Everything has an answer. You might not like the answer always, but everything has an answer. The biggest questions: the problem of evil, the problem of how God can do the things He does, the question of how the Holocaust could happen. The Haredi world has an answer. Mm. As modern people in the liberal world, we might find that answer insufficient. But within that world, that answer does exist, and it does suffice for those who live it. And for me, that was vital. And it's not to say that I miss it in the sense that I would like that back, because clearly I don't want that, because it was a worldview that gave you that was based on premises that I found ultimately faulty. But the certainty that you can live with when you have all that is something that you then have to replace with something else. Yeah. And for me, that's sort of been a bit of my life's project in the years since. And I've been out now for 10 years. And that's basically, I think it's a life project of so many of us who want to live conscientious lives and want to live meaningful lives. But for me, the pursuit of meaning was particularly urgent because I'd had meaning and I lost it, and I had to find something else. Right. And so I think many people take for granted that the pursuit of meaning is something we have to do in life. And to me, until I lost my faith, I thought, no, meaning is all figured out. Right. I don't have to do that work. And now it's a process of doing that work, which is sometimes very difficult. Right.
Well, we'll have to end with a question that may be a little too personal, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I reached the end of the book and I was in tears, crying, and so emotional that I forgot that I had a tissue right next to me, and I was using my hand, and it was a big mess. Would you call this an uplifting book, or a depressing book, or a positive, optimistic, pessimistic? How do you see this story ultimately? Because I can't say I felt bad, but I was upset, and the book kind of leaves you with both in a way.
I don't know if I could find a label for it. It was a serious question for me as a writer. And this book for me was a writing project. It was a literary project. It was not, I didn't have any grand message for the world with this book. I thought it was an important story, and I thought it was a compelling story, and a story that I felt that I could probably tell well. And as a writer, that's what I look for when I write. And so I felt I should write this story. But I did have a question of how do I end it? Do I end it with, oh, my life now is wonderful and that decision was so great because now I have so many friends and I'm doing the things that I want to do. I am writing. I'm engaged in the work that I want to be engaged in, all of which is true. Or do I end it on the utterly devastating loss that I experienced because of my decision? And I felt that I had to do the latter, even though for readers, it might not be that satisfying. Readers really sometimes do want a somewhat more cheerier ending, I think. But I couldn't give it a cheerier ending because the fact is that the loss that I experienced was so great that there is nothing that I could write that happened beyond that could mitigate the devastation that I had experienced in the wake of that. And so it felt to me like there was I had no choice but to end it on that. At the same time, I would say, the decision that I made to leave that world was absolutely the correct decision for me, and not for a moment do I ever have regret for making that decision. I might think I could have done certain things differently to protect myself more, but that is what I had to do. And so in that sense, it is, I don't know if hopeful is the right word, but it speaks to the importance of believing in your own passion and believing in your own pursuit and believing in your own need for an authentic life. And sometimes there is sadness and devastation involved with that, and that's unavoidable.
Yeah, I think it ultimately makes it fundamentally honest. I think that's sort of maybe the main characterization I can give of the book. That's Shulem Deen talking about his book, All Who Go Do Not Return, published by Grey Wolf Press in 2015. Shulem, thank you for being on the show.
Sure, thanks for having me.
And thanks once again to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.